You're listening to Manufactured with Kim van der Weert
and Jessie Lee, a podcast about sustainability and the making of fashion.
Join us every week in conversation with the people who manufacture what we wear. Hansika Singh is a sustainable fashion professional currently based in Bangalore, India. Last week, we talked to Hansika about her start in the fashion industry, her time with H&M as a merchandiser responsible for coordinating with various factories producing H&M goods, and her time in consumer advocacy, founding EcoFolk and running her own fashion boutique.
We chatted about what we can or should expect of brands with regard to sustainability. We concluded that it was something about embracing and communicating openly about their own role in fashion's sustainability woes. A willingness to publicly hold up the mirror and look inward.
We also looked at what it's reasonable to expect of consumers. Hansika so eloquently suggested that maybe reducing people to the singular role of consumer isn't helpful. We must find ways to flex our muscles as citizens and engage in questions about collective good. What do we want our society to look like? What should our collective goal be?
This week, we turn to Hansika's conviction that sustainability in the fashion world requires a system lens. We start by talking about what system change means to Hansika. Next, we get into some concrete example of what system change looks like in Hansika's current role with the Forum for the Future. And finally, we ask, if system change resonate, where does that leave the individual? Should we just throw up our hands? Where do the individual and the system intersect? And what can we, as sustainable fashion advocates, actually do? If you are on Instagram, please follow us to help us grow the conversation at manufactured_podcast.
Not much of an Instagram person? We feel you. We have a love-hate relationship with social media too. Sign up to our weekly newsletter instead on our website, www.manufacturedpodcast.com, to find out what we're reading, what we're thinking, and what we're wishing.
If you'd like to support us financially, you can make a Patreon donation via our homepage. And finally, don't forget to leave us a rating on iTunes and hit subscribe.
Let's talk about systems change. So you were, I guess, very conscious of the limits of what brands can achieve in sustainability. You went to the consumer side and left that experience also feeling a bit doubtful, maybe, of the power that consumers have in terms of changing the fashion industry. So tell us about where that took you next and your conclusion that the fashion industry requires systems level change. And it would be great if you could also include some kind of definition of what systems change means for you.
Right. Okay. So I think, so by this time I have about 6-7 years of work experience, and I realize that I have inadequate knowledge on a lot of things, because I think even by the virtue of my education, I was professionally trained to look at the world in a certain way and look at really, really narrow questions. And I come from a family which is, my father was an engineer and he was, working in production of planes. So I understood, he would talk about his works. I was fascinated by production. I was fascinated by fashion. And I did a 4-year course in apparel production. And what that really means is they teach you everything about how clothes are made, big machines.
Wow. Okay. That's very interesting. So it sounds more like industrial engineering direction.
Yes, there were components of industrial engineering, some management, everything that you would need to learn to be a good factory manager. So I decided it would be a good idea to go back to school maybe and try to educate myself. I had some savings and a lot of privilege to kind of make that life choice. So I did that. And I think that was quite a transformative experience, because in the kind of, and I consciously chose to go to university in India, because I know while looking at sustainability courses, I was coming across courses all over the world which were very attractive. But when I would dig deeper into the curriculum, it would be, and this might be a gross generalization, I'm sure there are great courses out there, but the vast majority of courses I was coming across are very either very technical in nature or very, very managerial in nature. And so either you're trying to manage that, the whole risk way of sustainability, or saying, yeah, these are some innovations and some technical ways of looking at things, and you can just fix it, which really didn't sit with, all that I was thinking about the word at that time. And I came very close to where I was in Bangalore. There was a university, and I was hearing some very interesting conversations happening there. And I was like, this is a good place to, go and learn more about how the word works. Maybe it'll teach me a thing or two, if nothing else. And I think, yeah, in that context, I think I, for example, never realized my caste privilege in this country. So caste system is like India's version of racism, but we just do it within our own race. So, I mean, and I never realized the kind of caste privileges that I hold. Never really critically questioned the role of colonization in making the way the word looks currently, and how a lot of these industries have their like roots in slave labor, and to then expect that they will be distributive overnight is such an oxymoron, because they are really serving well the purpose of whatever they were designed to serve, right? And that's what a fundamental redesign and reshift of things mean, if more of us kind of see that. And at least my own education till that point had not prepared me to look at the word in that way. And I think I walked out being a big proponent of liberal education, along with any professional courses that we all do, because I I mean, it really equips you to deal with these questions of collective choices. I don't think you might do really well professionally with a certain kind of education, but true education really allows you to, engage with the more complex questions. So I think while doing this, I kind of came across the idea of systems change, and I was very impressed by the work of Elinor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the economics Nobel Prize in economics.
Okay, so let's talk about Elinor Ostrom for a moment. What about her work really resonated with you?
I think Elinor Ostrom did some revolutionary work around the idea of commons and common pool resources. So, in my imagination, prior to I had come across Elinor Ostrom's work, and I think this is true for the larger public imagination, the word commons is synonymous with the phrase tragedy of commons. And while studying development and sustainability, this was one of the myths that was busted for me. So the idea of theory of commons has a very interesting history. It comes from this gentleman, Garrett Hardin, in 1968. And he's using the example of a pasture land to describe how people with cows are using that pasture, and they would want to maximize, put more cows in, get more out of the pasture. And because of this, he makes the case that people inevitably end up using natural resources to the point that they collapse eventually. And that is why such systems do not see long-term success. And he was perhaps making a point about private ownership and enclosure. He was writing in these times of when perhaps enclosures were very, very common, justifying them. But ever since, many authors have pointed out that what Hardin was referring to as commons was in fact what he meant as open access. So common pool resources are not always open access, and you can take examples of fisheries, and you can take example of a lake or pasture lands. They are managed according to certain principles, and they can be managed in different regimes. But what Ostrom did was she went back and looked for examples of various community managed resources. And what she
community
did was
managed resources that didn't result in this tragedy,
correct,
in this
exactly.
like depletion of the natural resource itself.
Exactly. So for centuries, communities have been managing systems, natural resources in ways which have not led to their collapse. On the contrary, they have become a part of the human systems have become a part of the ecological system, and they have co-adapted simultaneously. And it's in a kind of nice regenerative equilibrium. And so her work was very empirical. She studied various different communities across the world. And so she did not invent the idea of commons. She's in some sense rediscovering this commons that has existed for a certain number of years, but which was kind of hidden in this new myth of tragedy of commons. Yes.
Right. So it's like you have this one narrative, which I think is pervasive, tragedy of commons. And yet there are people out there who are looking at ways in which this might not always be true, which is, somehow a relief.
Agree. And I think one of the reasons why that landed so well was because what she was essentially rejecting is this notion of seeing people and individuals as selfish, right? And that's the only explanation for human behavior in the rational notion of economics as we propagate, right? That if people are left to their own, they will act in really selfish ways. I think in her model of understanding people, they have moral standards. They are vulnerable. They respond to the larger context. But yeah, I think she really brings out the ability of people to cooperate and not just compete in ways that is good for themselves, for their societies, but also largely for sustainability of our natural systems. So I think that was the key point for me to take away from. And I find resonance in a lot of her ideas. I mean, I came across another very influential systems thinker, Donella Meadows, in university, and I mean, she would define systems change in a very very unique way. She has a very nice paper on it, but like really simple ways. So a system could be anything that has boundaries and set of subcomponents that interact with each other through relationships. And you can look at anything in the world and you would find a system there. So you have education system, you have legal system, you have the whole fashion industry as a system, right? And so what Donella Meadows did was she based on all like her years of work, she identified these places that you can interfere in a system to create radical change. So if you create, let's say, loops of information in a certain way, positive or reinforcing loops or balancing loops, and how does that change the nature of the system? And I think the one that stuck me like really nicely is like when you change the goal of a system altogether, what that does, right? So that's like a more higher level, and I think there are some 12 or 13 places or levers of change, as she calls it, where you can interfere in a system and change, create change in the system. And so changing the goal of a system was a profound one, which I also experienced in my work later on, which was to look at the education system of India, right? And if you kind of change the goal of education system from a very marks oriented, you pass the exam, get marks, use that as a way to get to the next stages, to a more learning outcome oriented system, then it really changes the behavior of people within that system, right? Because they know what they will be evaluated against at the end of the day. And when we are individual people in a system, I think we are intuitively responding to what we think is expected of the system, right? What we will be evaluated against. And if you just somehow manage to change that, it just creates its own profound impact in the system, in which you will start noticing people's behaviors are changing. So I think that was my introduction to systems change, and I was very motivated to work, more in this direction. But those jobs are not, they don't come in abundance, and I was not feeling particularly entrepreneurial right after my master's, because I had done a bit of that right before going to school. So I was working with a corporate sustainability responsibility firm right before I joined Forum for the Future, which is where I work currently. And one of the ways that we work with is using the systems change techniques. And what that really entails is like getting a bunch of people together who have a stake in the problem and making a system map, like enabling everybody to look at what it really looks like. Because we all think we know, but when you see a map of a system, you really realize, like, it hits you, oh, there are these so many moving interconnected parts. And then it becomes easy to, not easy, but it becomes more approachable or accessible to find out, okay, if we do this here in the system, things might change a little bit.
Yeah. So maybe I think it might be helpful to give an example. With Forum for the Future now, one of the main projects you're working on is Cotton 2040,
yes, yeah,
right?
Correct.
So tell us a bit about, what does a systems change approach look like in this specific project?
Right. So Cotton 2040 is a project that Forum for the Future has been convening for the last 5 years. And this has been supported by the Lourdes Foundation. And I think we went in asking the big question of, what would it mean to, build more uptake of sustainable cotton? What would it mean for the cotton industry to be more sustainable, more broadly? And I think in every phase of the project, we worked on, we arrived at a conclusion and we said, this is what is needed right now. And we kind of delivered that. So in the immediate last phase, we realized that there are so many standards in sustainable cotton itself, right? And so you have an organic cotton standard, you have better cotton, then you have fair trade. And what would it mean for these standards to come together and create an alignment to, see eye to eye on what metrics of impact would look like? So I think that was one of the things that we tried to achieve in the last phase. Another thing was to just put the knowledge out there, because sometimes I think the information flows, and that's also one of the levers of change that Donella Meadows identify is if you shift the information flow in the system, that also creates its own impact in the system. So we created something called the Cotton Up Guide, which is a free resource for the entire fashion industry at large. It's open source to refer and understand, kind of demystify this whole what is sustainable cotton, what are the standards behind it, what does it mean, what are the impacts that we're looking at, why do we want the industry to be more sustainable, so like defining the problem, then laying out all the different options for a brand to choose from, and to really realize for an organization where they are in their journey of sustainable cotton, how can they kind of get more ahead in that journey. Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that we did in the last phase.
So when I hear that, it sounds wonderful. But as a factory manager or a former factory manager, my question, of course, like when I hear this, it's very clear that a systems change approach requires collaboration and a diversity of perspectives, because I think, and tell me if I got it right, but it's about somehow recognizing that the world is complex and interconnected, and that change is not always linear and can happen at multiple levels at the same time. And therefore, we have to have a lot of people in the conversation realigning around a new goal. And that really, it's hard for me to imagine how that happens without also talking about power. Because there are certain stakeholders who, for whatever reason, have a vested interest in the system as it stands. Right. Then there are also stakeholders like suppliers or factory managers who, for a lot of reasons, are probably quite unwilling to participate openly in the conversation. Right. And it comes back to trust between brands and suppliers and the absence of that trust. So how do you shift the flow in information without also somehow facilitating a shift in power? Because that, for me, seems like a prerequisite, and that's where I get stuck. So what do you say to people, like, maybe not skeptics, but people who might have that reaction or that response?
I think you're very right in identifying that none of the, it sounds great on paper, but of course, it'll hit the same challenges that any well-meaning initiative would hit when you go in the real world and you come across these power structures. And I think we're very cognizant of that in our work, and we try to eliminate biases around, inequalities as much as we can. And that is a limited capacity. We are a non-profit.
Can you give an example of how you do that?
So when we are doing the system diagnosis, for example, and I can give you an example of our work on regenerative agriculture that we were doing in the US, for example, which was funded by a corporate foundation. And when we were in the systems diagnosis phase, the question we were asking is the broad question of what will it take to scale up regenerative agriculture in the US? And if your funder is a big corporate house, you would intuitively imagine that it will be hard to, let's say, get a indigenous community group on the table. But we managed to do that in the stakeholder consultation, as well as the eventual workshop where we were drawing the system map and agreeing on what is it that's missing. We managed to get all kind of diverse voices on the table. And I think that's the kind of trust that we, for the future, has built over the years, where, we understand and recognize these power imbalances, and we make sure we could be funded in a certain way. We could be funded by, maybe certain existing powerful forces. But that doesn't stop us from speaking truth to power in most of the times. And that's why we have the reputation of being called a critical friend by some of, our corporate partners that we work with. I think we're very candid in that sense. And in our limited capacity, we try to create that shift as much as we can. And of course, there are a lot of things that are, also needed on a much wider scale, wherein the industry needs to get towards certain kind of realizations. And by only having these repeated conversations, can you start building more and more trust? So another example that I always give in this case is, and Forum has a legacy of being an organization which started in the UK and then became international. So we are very aware of these questions. So something that our Singapore team is working on currently is a project called Circular Leap Asia, which is really looking at the question of what would circular economy look like from a manufacturer-led perspective. Because we always talk, like you rightly said, we talk about these big brand green dreams of, coming from a very brand-led perspective. And when we think of leaders, we immediately think of brands. But we should also recognize, the agency and leadership of big manufacturers who are sitting in Asia and a lot of other parts of the world, who would also, I mean, they are the most impacted by some of these decisions, right? And the Circular Leap Asia project kind of does a system inquiry with them to understand what are those areas that they can work with to make their business more circular, which will not just for the benefit of saying yes, you're circular, but also helps them in a certain way in addressing some inefficiencies in the way they're working.
I want to talk a little bit about the role of the individual in systems change, because I think it's often something that when we talk about systems change on a theoretical level, it makes a lot of sense. But I think it can also runs the risk of leaving the individual to feel quite unempowered about what's their role in trying to be an agent of change in the world. And I raise this because most of the feedback that we've gotten to this podcast and also to a lot of the articles that I've written has come from, I don't know what to call them, but maybe I would call them like internal dissidents. Like people who are working within brands or working within sustainable fashion spaces that are a little bit more mainstream, who kind of see all of the things that we have discussed today, but feel very unempowered to do anything about it.
Right.
And I'm curious, and I don't know if you have an answer, and if you don't, that's okay. But I've been thinking a lot about this group or this cohort of people, because what can I do, or what do they need to be able to exert some kind of influence within the spaces that they work? And that's why I wonder what you think about that question, and whether systems change has anything to contribute to that question.
A great question, I think, and having been a dissident in multiple companies, I think I can really, it's a question that I've thought a lot about. And more recently, I've been more hopeful about this question, and I'll tell you why. Being a systems change organization, we don't lose any opportunities to analyze, how the world is changing. And I think COVID was, in some sense, that opportunity for us to. So we were in the process of writing our annual publication, which is the Futures of Sustainability report, which comes out next month. And what we did was, in a pre-COVID scenario, we had come up with these different bunch of dynamics on, what are these different forces that are shaping sustainability in the world. And one of the obvious things that stood out was, the question of injustice and inequality, and how that's, gaining more and more prominence because inequality is really growing. And of course, in the post-COVID world, that has just become an even more important conversation to have. And I was just helping write a chapter on that today, and I was writing something about the generational value transition that will happen sometime in the middle of the 2020s, where you will have so many of these Generation Z and millennials, rising the ladders of power in some sense, but their value system will essentially be something that is not what we have perhaps seen in these settings before, right? And that will create a lot of internal pressure in these organizations, one that they need to be, and I know this from experience, that a lot of organizations already recognize this and are responding to this, that until now, all of this was perhaps a more external conversation, that the, more, PR related concept. But when this becomes very real is when this activism starts to come from within your employees. And I think that's a great lever of systems change, if you ask me. And I think that makes me really helpful that these people exist, they exercise their critical thinking, and they are asking questions when they're sitting on the table in those rooms.
Is that the most they can do, you think? Ask questions?
No, I would go back to.
I don't know. I don't know, because I say this because I have had a lot of conversations with people who are like, well, I try, but they feel frustrated and they feel like they're not getting anywhere, or they feel like, I think often people professionally, their scope of responsibility is so narrow that asking questions allows them to see how their very narrow slice of work fits within a bigger picture. And yet their responsibility remains that pretty narrow slice. And so then they're left with this okay, I recognize, and I don't want to use the word cog in a machine because I don't think that's nice, but I recognize that I am that in my professional capacity, I am facilitating I am an enabling piece for a much bigger machine. And now I have the awareness, or I see how that is how I am, implicated in that, I guess. And yet still my responsibility is only this, right?
That can be and I think a lot of it's something that I've experienced and I continue to perhaps experience, because I don't think there's any perfect place or organization where you can feel, yes, I woke up today and I made all the difference in the world. There are frustrating days in my job as well, and I can relate to that, right? And what that does to people is, it, at least to me, I think it creates alienation sometimes. Sometimes, your mental health is compromised. And I think in those moments I tell myself, it'll be really brave of me to just take care of myself and go with my day. But obviously, like you said, is that what we can do? No, it shouldn't be that much, just that much.
I think there are slightly more to do as an individual in a big company, or let's say as an individual in a system. It's like a boat. I'm waiting for a wind to sail. So there's no wind. So what can I do? As an individual, I must feel very frustrated or powerless to see if I can push some of the small activities become bigger, and then bigger and bigger, and eventually not just on myself, of course, but with others. So eventually there is a trend.
I love that analogy. It's clear that one of the ingredients or prerequisites is redefining the goal. And that's what you spoke to also, Hansika, earlier in this episode, is that it's about getting all the stakeholders around the table and redefining the goal. But it's not like we can just get the whole fashion industry together around the table, discuss what that goal should be, and then come up with action points for each player and move forward. So the question, I think, really is, how do we change the goal? And for me, this is where I see some hope or some room for optimism, and also where it gets interesting, because for me, it's really where individual action and systems change maybe kind of seem to connect. Because individual action, I think, is necessary to get enough people to share a common understanding of a problem and to have a similar view on what needs to change. I mean, getting to that shared understanding, I think, is only possible through individual action. And it's only then that we can kind of move in the same direction. So maybe individual action is about getting that critical mass that ultimately results in the kind of cultural shift which ultimately redefines the goal. And I think, Hansika, that speaks to what you were saying about the next generation of leaders and CEOs who have a totally different value system that might hopefully start to appear in the mid-2020s. So it's not about reducing individual actions to a drop in an ocean, useless in the face of such vastness. It's about reframing it. Those internal dissidents matter because by having the conversations, they change the culture. And really, a cultural shift is another way, at least in my mind, of saying a shift in goals. And that's what will enable us to also then subsequently redirect at a systems level. So, maybe I take back what I said. Maybe it's not, is asking questions all we can do. Maybe it's actually the critical thing to do. Hansika, thank you so much for joining us. Getting to hear about your incredibly thoughtful and deliberate journey has really created some more space, some much needed space for the imagination. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to Manufactured.
To learn more about our guests and the issues we've chatted about today, sign up for our weekly newsletter on our website, www.manufacturedpodcast.com, or find us on Instagram at manufactured_podcast.
We'd also love to hear your stories and what you think. Collecting with listeners is the most rewarding part of what we do, so please don't be shy.
To be the first to find out about new episodes, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd also love it if you left us a review. Leaving a review helps other people find our show. And finally, if you'd like to support us financially, you can make a Patreon donation via our website homepage.
Thanks for listening and see you next week.